Today we start a new journey with nutrients, nitrate and phosphate. Turns out much of what we thought we knew has turned out to be only partially true, some of it all the way wrong, and some of the things that we now know for sure have had some unintended consequences in our reef tanks, causing us to play whack-a-mole where we solve today's problem but create a much bigger one tomorrow, often using the biggest hammer possible. So today, what you're going to see is my own personal journey with nitrate and phosphate over the last 17 years of maintaining reef tanks, starting with, is this really only about algae and pests? So the answer is no. Most of the conversation should actually be about the animals that we care for and their nitrogen and phosphorus needs, and how do we care for them best, and most of this series will actually be about that. But way back at the beginning, most of this all started with, how do we fight algae and pests? Almost every conversation that I had in the very beginning stages of reefing was, how do we use ultra low levels of nitrate and phosphate to starve the algae out? Having so little nitrogen and phosphorus available that it's a limiting factor to growth, it just can't grow without it. In fact, if we get it so low, you may even starve it to the point that it dies and disappears from the tank. So this isn't just aquariums, it's also the ocean reefs, as well as other photosynthetic applications like agriculture. In a healthy ocean reef, in many cases, the phosphate levels and nitrate levels are down into the parts per billion, below where most of us could even test for, and the result of that is very little algae in most healthy reefs. But the flip side of that is also true. Most scientists will agree that those ultra low levels of nitrogen and phosphorus are also limiting factors to the corals as well. Meaning those parts per billion nitrate and phosphate limits the growth of the algae, but also limits the growth of the corals. And some of these things you can actually see in polluted areas of the ocean where nitrate and phosphate are elevated, and you'll see that algae is overtaking the ocean. So as it relates to photosynthesis, farming, and agriculture, it's almost the exact same thing. Last year's crops sucked up all the nitrogen and phosphorus out of the soil, and now the depleted levels are a limiting factor to this year's crops unless we replace it. And that's why most plant fertilizers are actually based on nitrogen and phosphorus. Now, this is the exact same thing in the aquarium. Yesterday, we added some fish food, which will add nitrogen and phosphorus to the tank. Then the corals, the fish, and the algae uptook it for their own metabolic processes. And then today it was depleted, so we add more fish food. Now, the only thing that's different in this case is I actually want to care for the fish and the corals, and I just don't care that much about the algae. However, one of the big differences between these three organisms for this conversation is that the fish and the corals actually uptake nitrogen and phosphorus fairly slowly, whereas the algae can actually uptake it very quickly. So, while you can maintain really low levels and starve it off, if you have uncontrolled levels or you allow it to get very high, what you've essentially done is created a nitrogen and phosphorus battery for the algae just to explode once it takes hold. So is it nitrate or phosphate that's more effective at starving the algae out? And I believe it's very likely phosphate for a few different reasons. First, it's pretty well documented, and it's been my own personal experience that maintaining 0.03 phosphate or lower will slow down the algae growth, in many cases stop it, and in some cases completely wipe it out. It's also very easy to test for with something like a Hanna checker that will test all the way down that low. And there's many medias out there that will help you maintain those ultra low levels like GFO, lanthanum chloride, or phosphate E. But the flip side of that with nitrate is it isn't really clear at what nitrate level will we slow down coral growth. And even if we did know it, most of our test kits won't measure down that low, and the medias aren't as easy to use. Okay, so I've said algae and pests many times today, but what exactly does ultra low levels of nitrate and phosphate work on? In the last couple of decades, the reefing community has largely felt like all pests will be either limited by nutrients or fueled by nutrients, and that really hasn't proven out to be the case. So with some algae, like hair algae, we find that lowering nitrate and phosphate, specifically phosphate, works really well. But on things like Bryopsis, it may not. So why would that be? Well, some of these organisms actually just have different nitrogen and phosphorus needs, and they may uptake them differently as well. For instance, it may very well be that Bryopsis actually prefers ammonia and is able to uptake that before any other organism could. So there's also some confusion that often happens here. You might think you're at zero nitrate and phosphate, so why do I have these algae problems? But what's really happening is you're stuck in the middle of a cycle, meaning you're actually adding nitrogen and phosphorus every single day with the fish food, and the fish's metabolism is burning calories and adding nitrogen and phosphorus back to the tank every day as well. But on top of that, when you starved out that algae, it died and then broke down and added nitrate and phosphate back to the tank again to feed tomorrow's problem. So the big thing here is if you're going to fight a battle like this, you actually have to manually remove the algae so it breaks the cycle, gets the nitrate and phosphate out of the tank permanently. And another solution to that is actually filtration. So your filter socks and your skimmer and even your refugium, making sure that you maintain those on a daily level will help export the nitrate and phosphate and break the cycle. All right, so what about other pests which are commonly related to nutrients like cyanobacteria, or that red slime that grows on surfaces like sand, rock, or even sometimes on corals? I've seen no shortage of thousands of threads over the last couple of decades. They typically go with somebody asking for help because they have this problem in their tank, and most of the feedback is you probably have too high of nutrients feeding the cyanobacteria, probably related to your poor maintenance, and you need to fix that and get the levels back down to get rid of it. I don't say this kind of thing very often, but I'm going to say that that thought process is actually total garbage and really not helpful. And I say that because after 17 years of doing this and talking to tens of thousands of reefers, I have never met anyone that has solved cyano by lowering nutrient levels in their tank. Never, not once. I've never seen it myself. We've tried it, and it has never ever worked. So in that case, even if it has worked for someone, it almost never works. And I've also seen cyano break out in basically every level of nitrate and phosphate tank. So tanks I think that have been maintained immaculately with the best filtration and maintenance still have cyano. Some of the ones that I've seen that have 100 parts per million nitrate or even worse, unmeasurable, don't have cyano. I just don't see these things correlated in the way that all the advice should be related to this. In fact, I would just eliminate it from the equation. The same thing with dinos, which can look similar visually to cyano, but much more aggressive and take over the entire tank. And sometimes you'll actually see it completely disappear at night, come back in the morning, but by evening, completely overtaken the tank again. Just a much more aggressive organism, but similar to cyano, the advice was actually the same. You're in this pit because you have too high of nitrate and phosphate and you weren't maintaining your tank, and now all this nitrate and phosphate is feeding the dinos, but similar to that as well, I haven't met anybody who has actually reduced nitrate and phosphate and solved dinos. So this is one of those things we're still learning about and nobody knows completely for sure, but there certainly is some evidence that suggests that the real cause of dinos in many cases is actually zero nitrate and zero phosphate, and the reason for that is lack of biodiversity, specifically in new tanks and even more specifically in dry rock tanks, and even one more than that, dry rock tanks where we haven't added any bacterial biodiversity. So in many cases, we've actually seen people dose nitrate and phosphate directly to the tank, which would have been unthinkable before, but then watch the dinos go away. So why would that be? The reason again is that biodiversity. What the nitrate and phosphate have done is help fuel the growth of the beneficial organisms in the tank that just weren't there. And they weren't able to thrive or compete in an environment where there was no nitrate and phosphate. And many of the species of dinos may actually be able to thrive in a low nitrogen or low nitrate environment or even low both. But in any case, adding some nitrate and phosphate allows the beneficial bacteria and organisms to thrive in the tank and outcompete the dinos. So again, we're still learning here, and this might be as much about getting the right nitrogen and phosphorus levels, not too low, but also not too high, as it is about understanding some of the sterile type tanks that we're developing using dry rock and getting the right biological diversity in there, either by adding a small amount of established live rock or even biological diversity that can come in a bottle, which many people have also used to solve dinos as well. However, probably more important than all of that put together is actually understanding that algae and pests are actually only the smallest component of the nitrogen and phosphorus conversation. And it's really all about the animals that we're caring for. Now, phosphorus and nitrogen feed the animal. But more specifically, Is it the animal or the coral? Or is it the zooxanthellae that lives within the coral that utilizes the nitrogen phosphorus? And how can we use that information to produce a better result? And that's what's coming up.